My name's Cale. I work for a company called Spruce, hellospruce.com. And today I'm giving this presentation in conjunction with Laneway Education, who are an education provider based in, and they have a team in Sydney that I've worked with in giving some presentations in the past. So I guess today I'm going to be going through a list of tools that kind of align with a bit of a process as well for building, a simple website that can be used in validating an idea or some designs that you might have for a product or for a business. I work a lot with lots of clients and especially startups in putting together, early stage concepting and websites for them. And I work a lot with people in getting websites together without needing prior development or design experience. So, I guess the first step in the process that I'll be going through is design concepting. So, building a website without having a basic idea of how it should look or feel can be difficult. And so design concepting can really help to create a consensus or an agreement in some of the more overarching aspects of the website, and how it should appear or function. And if you don't have visual design experience yourself, or you don't have access to a visual designer, then a mood board is a really great way of getting references together. So Go Mood Board is a free tool that you can use to put a mood board together, take screenshots of websites that are out there and include, and it also has some commenting functionality and things as well. Two really great resources for finding references of other websites that might align with the look and feel that you're after are awards.com and webflow.com's kind of discovery and popular section. I mention this as webflow.com is a no-code tool, which means that you can use it to create a website without needing to know how to develop. It's kind of the first thing that we always start with when we're putting together a new site and thinking about, what it might look like. So the second step is defining an information architecture. So an information architecture is essentially a map of the information and content that you want to include into your site. It doesn't have to be super fancy. A sitemap is the most fundamental form of an information architecture. So it's essentially just the pages and the sections within the pages that you might want to include into your site. And it's really important to define one of these before you go ahead in writing copy or defining symbolic elements like photography, icons, type, that type of thing. Glue Maps is a free tool that can be used to define a sitemap. And if you don't have experience, a UX designer by trade, then it's a good way of kind of getting your feet wet in definition of an information architecture. It's also useful to create one of these by cross-checking the references that you may have defined in a mood board. You imagine that a homepage is going to have an amount of sections or an about or a team page as well. And so, or any other page that, might align with the references that you've placed into your mood board that theoretically are competitors or similar players in the market. So you can essentially shopping list from that mood board into your information architecture or your sitemap. It's the first one. After you've defined an information architecture, you can start thinking about copywriting. Written content for the website, which is basically just headers and paragraphs. So this can include things like your value proposition, product features, service USPs, team biographies, that type of thing. So it's really important, to create a website or to create the copy up front, because creating a website without having an understanding of content that will be included will usually mean having to change how it has to be designed and built later on. So content means text and media, and so copywriting, obviously being the text, is one side of that. And in definition of copy, it can give you the opportunity to decide what media or images and video and audio could align with what you've written. And so it's a really good first thing to do, first protocol. Yeah, and obviously it can be tricky to write copy. Not everyone has the gift of the gab. So, and when I talk about copywriting in the context of creating, a website yourself from scratch, it doesn't have to be the final copy necessarily. It's more about defining the scope of content, and so that's where referencing back to your mood board and looking at how some of the other sites that you've referenced have included an amount of copy, a character count. That's what character count online is good for. That says this is how large your paragraphs or headers might be. Is really something that you can just use in creating a stopgap for the copy that you can have. And Libsyn.com is great for just generating filler so that you can kind of apply a stopgap that doesn't necessarily have to be, that final written word that you'd like in the site. This also really lets you kind of put pen to paper in definition of the information architecture by thinking about, down to the level of words, how many sections you might want across how many pages. There is another consideration that's also important in web design around content, and that is whether or not the content you have is static or dynamic. So static content is the type of things that ideally you're not really going to change very often, that might sit on a homepage or an about page, things like that. Whereas dynamic content refers to, where you might have sets of information such as blog articles or, a portfolio or news or media items. So if you are looking at creating a kind of simple website up front, it's probably important to focus on static content initially before moving on to dynamic content. And so, something to do in definition of copywriting. Awesome. So, visual design. So while you may not be a visual designer by trade, there are still some fundamental visual considerations that should be given in styling a website. And these are things that anyone can really think about and do. Again, you don't have to have gone to art school or anything. So this includes a color palette, icons and illustration, photography, and typography as well. So there's a bunch of tools here that anyone can use. And they all have free instances. So colors.co is a really good tool for helping you to define a color palette if you've already got one in mind. So you already have colors that you'd like. If you don't have an idea of the colors and you're scared about whether or not they're going to work together and whether there's a theory that should be applied and etc., chroma.co is a really good tool that'll help you just against your preferences or against a wide set of colors that you like, define a palette that will work, within the remit of design fundamentals. Unsplash is great for getting free stock photography. LS Graphics is great for getting the same for illustration. They do also have paid though. Fonts, Google Fonts are obviously just good for free web fonts. And the Noun Project and Nuclear app are really good for getting icons. So if you spend some time to define a color palette, find some photos and graphics and fonts and icons and just, put that in a folder somewhere on your computer, having those as a basis in design to move ahead with your site is a really great and important thing to do. The next thing, actually, I'll kind of skip that one and go on to component libraries. So the component library is essentially all the building blocks that you might want to put into your website, or in other words, styled objects, that will appear frequently and consistently. So this is things like headings, paragraphs, buttons, links, all the stuff that you typically find on a website. And so having defined, the visual design elements that I just mentioned, that should give you an idea of how you'd like your site to look and feel. And with the outline of the content that you have, means that you can start to piece together the different elements and marry those two things together and create a kind of consistent. Sorry about that. Consistent and succinct approach to how you build the site. So again, the tool that I'm mentioning here is the no-code platform that can be used is webflow.com. They have a really great set of UI kits. Some of them are free that you can use, so that out of the box you can kind of start applying those design fundamentals, the color palette, the type, the icons, all of those things into your own instance of UI kit. And essentially having a UI kit ahead of laying out a page or thinking about what it might look like in design is it gives you building blocks that you can kind of run with. So yeah, once you've got your UI kit in tow, you can then start to think about page layout. So this is how the elements for the components from that kit might structure or display on the page. So that's things like placing a navigation bar at the top of the page or the footer at the bottom. So yeah, the mood board that you've used at the very start as well will have layouts that other web pages have used. So it's a really great thing to kind of circle back on and think about, and the fact that you've defined an amount of copy that has an amount of characters to it will help you to determine whether or not the layouts you're choosing will work, and then the fundamental photography and icons and things you've collected will help you to piece those layouts together. So all of the things that you've done before can come together in definition of a page layout, and then the building blocks that you use are that UI kit that I mentioned before. So yeah, it's essentially a matter of almost copying what exists in the mood board as your reference, but with your own style and flair to it. So yeah, again, I do mention Webflow just as an example. There's other no-code platforms like Squarespace and Wix that can also be used, but I just happen to prefer using Webflow. So yeah, all of these tools will let you worry about responsive display, so what it looks like on desktop, tablet, and mobile. And so in our day and age, that's something that you should think about as well, and can do through these tools. So once you've kind of got that together, if you don't have a designer in hand, then fair enough, you can do all of this yourself. If you do have a designer, then it's worth having them, put something like this together through a design tool such as Sketch or Figma or Adobe XD. I haven't mentioned these here because they are a little bit more advanced and probably need a designer to kind of be used. But if you do have access to one and they have put together some designs for your site, a really valuable step in a process ahead of developing a website is prototesting. We do this with all of our designs when possible. It's testing that ahead of building that essentially means you can validate whether or not people understand or love, the designs that you've put together. And in particular, that means looking for click patterns, heat maps, or time that the mouse is spent in a particular position, optimal pathing, so as they click through page to page, and then also bounces. So yeah, we use a tool called maze.design. It's really great. It lets you kind of port your static designs in and set up, tasks that you can give to people to achieve. And it also defines all of these, pieces that you might need to look for into a kind of succinct analytics and like report that you can kind of export and use. But yeah, we find that all of the stuff that I've mentioned before is great for you to rapidly put a site together, and it doesn't necessarily mean you need to be a designer or a developer, but that validation of an idea really means having to put it out there to people. And while you can invest the time to develop this, turn it into code or HTML and CSS and things, it can be very valuable to ahead of doing that, running through a prototest round to see if, the aesthetics and the quite subjective artistic style that you may have come up with through this process is something that 10 or 20 or 30 other people are going to enjoy as well. So yeah. The last point that I'll mention is interaction design. So Interaction design talks about the changes or animation of elements that are controlled through user activities or that may happen automatically as a page loads. So this is stuff like, changes to buttons while mousing over or movement of background images while scrolling. So yeah, once you've kind of defined your page layouts and, you've got your component kit and the style all in there, and, your website works across desktop and down to mobile, it's really important to start thinking about the states that these things can go through. So, this includes things like hovers and clicks, and if something's open or if it should be visible or hidden. And so Webflow does a really good job of allowing you to do this again without having any technical experience. They have a great wealth of resources you can use in their university, which is just like their knowledge base. And yeah, they have an animation library that you can kind of utilize out of the box alongside anything that you've built with their platform. So yeah, I guess that kind of covers off all of the steps. And after you've kind of thought about interaction, essentially you should have a website that you can use. I do have examples of all of the stuff that I've gone through as well. I'm just not able to share it through this piece of technology. But yeah, if anyone wants to kind of reach out as a follow-up and request some of the sample material, I'm happy to share it all, and you can use it as a reference point in essentially putting something together for yourself. Yeah, I guess my email is klcael@hellospruce.com if you did want to request any of that material. But yeah, that's it for today. Not sure, does anyone have any questions? It doesn't look like I've had any come through. Wait on the line in case anyone did want to, though. Hello? Thank you. Yep, I can see the questions now. Let's just go through these one by one, shall we? Yes, definitely. And to Mel and Sid, for sure, we tend to use either Google Analytics or Heap. We most of the time for smaller websites, we like to use Google Analytics because we can also use something called Google Optimize, which lets us do A/B split testing with minimal to no code requirements. So what I mean by that is you can kind of test out, sentence 1 versus sentence 2, or image 1 versus image 2. And that integrates with Webflow again without any need for script. So yeah. Okay, Jai said, thanks. That was a really good explanation. What would you say would be one of the most important but undervalued design flow elements of a page? Design flow elements. That's an interesting set of words. I think thinking about, I'm not sure if this will answer the question, but thinking about eye patterns is really important. There's two things called the L pattern or the T pattern, which talk about the way that people's eyes will move across the page. And I think people who aren't designers tend to maybe steer away from those without realizing it. But what you kind of have to think about is that people will either read down and right, or they'll kind of read, it's a bit hard to describe it, like across and then down. And so you want to maybe just think about, and then there's also Z pattern, which is like across, over, and across. And I think you want to be thinking about those in construction of elements into any particular section of a page. And I talk about a section meaning roughly the size of a desktop or, a mobile, so that it's the thing that they're going to scroll and stop on. I hope that kind of answers the question. Are the slides available after the event? Again, if you shoot me an email, kayla@hellospruce.com, I can send it through. Otherwise, I'm not sure if they're available through the Sparktest thing, but I'm happy to email them through. And as I mentioned, I can send through a bunch of links to to examples of all of this stuff. Usually when I give this talk, I'm able to show them. That's Mark B. So, Sean, even following all those steps, how often do you need to get back to the start and rework your ideas? I wouldn't say I go all the way back to the start, Sean. A mood board is an aesthetic reference, and generally that doesn't need to change. There should always be evolution of copy, though. And I think, so art direction, probably not so much. And, those basics in design fundamentals that get chosen. The thing that prototesting often raises as needing change is layout, and is also copy. So, people not intuiting what's been written, or struggling to find things on the page based on how they've been laid out. It's rarely that the more fundamental things need to go through change. But I would say that as soon as you build a website, it has an expiry date. So I'm always going back and reworking the stuff that we work on. Okay, Mel. Is there a benefit to contacting the designers of sites you like? I guess it's a hard question to ask. It depends if they're available, I suppose. What I would say is both Squarespace and Webflow have really great designer and expert communities, and these no-code platforms. And so if you've gone through the process that I've described, and you've created something, but you feel like it's only 80% of the way there is a huge wealth of people that can kind of take that and run with it for you. So maybe not necessarily finding the designers of the sites you like, because I'd imagine a lot of them have full-time jobs and might not be very available. But there's definitely, communities out there, both in Webflow or Squarespace, that I would recommend you reach out to for something like this, and that can help. Jamil and Sid. Any advice on how to narrow down the focus of the site to make sure it is clear on how to test your idea? I think it's kind of the other way around, right? Creating the mood board to shopping list the things that the parts you want, and then making sure that you don't go overboard in how much copy you write by aligning with the limits of the copy in those sites. I know it sounds strange, but what you might not realize about why you like the thing that you put on your mood board is that it did go through design consideration, and so you get to leverage that. And if you do that up front, it means that you are kind of narrowing down from the beginning. I think thinking about information architecture and the way you write your copy means that you're not overwriting copy. Whereas if you just write content from scratch and don't think about how it might fit into sections that you've got as a reference, is the trap that most people get into when they write copy, and means that it's too verbose and too much for a site. So it's I guess the process I've described is how we kind of preemptively narrow things down. Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah, someone's asked for my email. I'll give it again. It's kael@hellospruce.com. Yeah, Canva, to Jen, Canva is kind of a mood board. I think that it's good to kind of make sure you screenshot other finished design when you mood board versus like scrapping elements together. And I also think that a UI kit is something that needs to be much more a shopping list of the actual components that go into a website. Canva kind of is that, but is also like designed for print design stuff as well. So it can be used as a mood board. I'll put it that way. And Marie Walton, thank you. How long does this whole process normally take when you go through it with clients? So this talk is kind of a skim down of another workshop I used to run, which was getting a group of people to actually build a website in a day. So, I used to call this build a site in a day. So theoretically that's possible, and that's the minimum amount of time. I think that where you can really spend a lot of time is in the animation and interaction side of things. And then just in refining copy, that never ends. How much time do I have? 17. Okay, cool. Do I like infinite scrolling as part of my pages? They have a use. There's pros and cons to infinite scrolling versus traditional pagination versus, using filtering instead of. And I think it just depends on the data set that you're working with, the total size of it, and whether or not there's other related data sets that you would want to use in subdivision of that as part of navigation. If no other data set exists and people want to access that data set free form, then infinite scroll can be nice. But, sometimes people are looking for something specific and it's not so great as a pattern in that case. Yeah. Repeat email. I think I've given it 3 times. One more time. CAEL at hellospruce.com. Yeah. For a site with the primary function of selling, what do you recommend the most? Shopify, Webflow? If by selling you do mean e-commerce versus subscriptions, then we tend to build Webflow and integrate with Shopify directly, either through buy button or their JavaScript API. So there's a little bit of coding involved there. Oh, no, with the buy button actually. But if the scope of the products you need to sell and the size of the shop, it gets into like hundreds to thousands of products, then we tend to move away from Webflow and recommend a more traditional, headless CMS with a front-end application development framework such as React or Vue or whatever, blah, blah, blah. We have our own design system that we use for that. That gets a bit more complicated, and that's where basically if it gets too big, we would recommend not using a no-code approach. But Shopify is the one that works in most cases, and we like to use Webflow just for the customizability of the code in comparison to Wix or Squarespace. That's for Andrew. I think those were all the questions. Yeah. Oh. Sorry, I'm going to take it out. Is there any, let me see in chat. There are questions tab, yeah. Okay. I think that was everything. All the questions are answered now. Did anyone have anything else final or? Oh. Yeah, no problem, Mark. Thanks. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I guess that answers all the questions by the looks of it for today. So I think I'll wrap up the call now. I gave my email a few times, I think. So if anyone has any follow-ups, happy to answer those and send through the Prezzo as well as any of those reference materials. But otherwise, yeah, thanks everyone for joining and listening to me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, have a good day, everyone. Bye.